One of the most memory-hold stories of 2023 was that the CEOs of all of these companies, Sam Altman, Demis Hassabis, Dario Amodei, signed this statement saying, hey, this could cause human extinction. Let's be careful. They said it. It's kind of like if Oppenheimer and Einstein had written a letter warning that nuclear weapons could kill people, and then everybody just sort of forgot about it.
Few people understand artificial intelligence and machine learning as well as MIT physics professor Max Tegmark. He's the author of Life 3.0, Being Human in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, and founder of the Future of Life Institute.
The painful truth that's really beginning to sink in is that we're much closer to figuring out how to build this stuff than we are to figuring out how to control it.
Where's the US-China AI race headed? How close are we to science fiction type scenarios where an uncontrollable AI can wreak major havoc on humanity? And how do we prevent that?
Do you know that AI is currently the only industry in the US that makes powerful stuff that has less regulation than sandwiches?
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. Max Tegmark, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thank you.
We've been seeing an incredible growth in AI, especially through these chatbots. That's what all the kind of fuss is about, maybe some also in robotic and some other areas, some very interesting applications. But I have this sense, I have this intuition that what's really happening is much, much greater than that at a level that perhaps I can't even grasp at this point. So why don't you tell me what's really going on here?
So it is indeed hard to see the forest for all the trees because there's so much buzz in AI every week, every day. There's some new thing. So if we zoom out and actually look at the forest, we humans have spent a lot of time over the millennia wondering about what we are, how our bodies work, and etc. And hundreds of years ago, we figured out more about muscles and built machines that were stronger and faster. And more recently, there was a quest to try to understand how our brains process information and accomplish tasks. The name artificial intelligence is coined in the 50s. People started making some progress. Since then, it's mostly been chronically overhyped. Mm-hmm. The people who started working on this said they were going to do a summer workshop in Dartmouth and kind of figure it out. It didn't happen. But for the last 4 years, it's switched to being underhyped, where progress has actually been much faster than people expected. So to give you an example, I've been doing AI research at MIT as a professor there for many years, and as recently as 6 years ago, almost all my colleagues thought that building a machine that could master language and knowledge, kind of at the level of ChatGPT 4, was decades away. Maybe it would happen in 2050. And they were obviously all wrong, because it already happened. And since then, AI has gone from kind of high school level to kind of college level to PhD level to professor level and beyond in some areas, which leads us close to the point which the godfather of the whole field, Alan Turing, talked about in 1951. He said, look, folks, if you ever make machines that are just better, can outthink us in every way, they're going to take control. That's the default outcome. But he said, chill out. It's far away. Don't worry. I'll give you a test, though, a canary in the coal mine, when you need to pay attention. It's called the Turing test. That's when machines can master language and knowledge, and which is what's now happened with ChatGPT 4 and so on. And so basically, after a lot of hype and failed promises, we're now at the point where we're very close to probably the most important fork in the road in human history, where we have to ask ourselves, are we going to somehow build inspiring tools that help us do everything better and cure diseases and make us prosperous and strong? Or are we going to just sort of throw away the keys to the planet by building some alien, amoral machine species that just sort of replaces us?
I really want to touch on this. I'm very fascinated about how you talk about the AIs that we're creating as alien, and that's very interesting. But just very briefly, what is the Turing test and how has it been passed now?
The Turing test, the way Alan Turing defined it, is an imitation game. You basically get to interact with a machine, maybe by typing. And the question is, can you tell the difference between a machine and a human? There was actually a nerd paper that was written by a bunch of scientists recently where they've now found that machines pass this test more often than humans even. They're even better at convincing people they're human than humans are. But in practice, passing the Turing test means that you really master language and basic knowledge and so on, the way that today's chatbots can clearly do. And the reason this test is so important is because if you ask it yourself, why is it, that when you go down to the zoo here in Washington, it's the tigers that are in the cages, not the humans? Why is that? Is it because we are stronger than the tigers or have sharper teeth? Of course not. It's because we're smarter, right? And it's kind of natural that the smarter species will dominate the planet. And that was the basic point Turing made, and it still stands. People who don't see this, I think, make the mistake of thinking of AI as just another technology like the steam engine or the internet, whereas Turing himself was clearly thinking about it as a new species. That might sound very weird, because your laptop isn't a species, of course, but if you think of a species as something that can make copies of itself and have its own goals and do things, we're not there now with AI. But if you imagine in a not distant future we have robots that can just outthink us in every way and outplan us and outstrategize us. Of course, they can also build robot factories and build new robots. They can build better robots. They can build still better robots, etc., and then gradually get more and more advanced than us. That checks every box of being a new species. And at that point, before that point, we have to ask ourselves, is that really what we want to do? We have this incredible gift. We're placed here as stewards of this earth, with an ability to use technology for all sorts of wonderful stuff. And I love tech as much as anyone. But don't we want to aim for something more ambitious than just replacing ourselves?
Again, before I start talking about this, this alien foreign thing which we seem to be creating ourselves, I've been thinking a lot about how these AIs learn with all sorts of information, and information has become increasingly politicized, especially over the last decade. It's always been a bit politicized, but in the last decade it's been sort of taken to a whole different level. This is something we used to have as a huge challenge for us at Epoch Times to cut through that. That's part of the reason I think we've had a lot of growth, is because I think we have. You haven't, Verity News now it's called, in a kind of an attempt to do the same sort of thing. But it's also been demonstrated that many of these chatbots, even at this, what I guess you would call still a primitive level, right, of AI development, they have huge holes in their knowledge and really biased ways of thinking. It's like the values of the programmers have basically kind of gone into them, right? And there's even ratings on how, what kind of values the different chatbots have.
Sure.
Well, we're not even talking about creating this, AGI or anything like that. That itself it seems a huge problem at this primitive level. Your thoughts?
For sure. I mean, George Orwell pointed that out. If someone can control the truth, in quotes, that's pushed onto people, that they can control the world, of course. And living in some sort of AI-fueled 1984 is not what I want for my children. It's basically the same thing as being a good journalist, which is that you pursue the truth. You follow the truth, whatever it is, even if it's not what you had hoped you were going to find. And I sometimes get asked what I mean by being a scientist, and my definition would be that a scientist is someone who would rather have questions they can't answer than answers they can't question. And you're laughing here, but
that's very good.
Think about Galileo. He asked some questions that the authorities didn't want him to ask. Look at people more recently who asked questions that were deemed inconvenient. All sorts of stuff that got them blocked on Facebook or whatever, and then later turned out to be true. And what we see is this is a quite timeless thing. And George Orwell was onto something. The first thing that people who want to manipulate the truth will do is accuse their critics of spreading disinformation. So as a scientist, I get really annoyed when people say, oh, just follow the science. Being a scientist is not like being a sheep and following what you're supposed to follow. It's asking all the tough questions, whether people get pissed or not about that. And that's why I created the Verity News site, where it's just like in science, you know, it's hard to figure out the truth. Let's be honest.
Very hard.
Very hard. You had the world's smartest physicists for hundreds of years believing in the wrong theory of gravity. And that wasn't even political. They believed in Newton, and then Einstein came along 300 years later and was like, oops, we were all wrong. So the idea that you can just figure out the truth by having some government-appointed or Facebook-appointed committee that's going to decide it for you is ridiculously naive, right? If it were so easy to figure out the truth, you could shut down the universities, shut down all the news organizations. I think science has the best track record historically of ultimately getting to the truth, closer to the truth. And so the idea with Verity was just to try to emulate that a little bit in media. Rule number one is you don't censor anybody, even if they're dressed badly or don't have a fancy degree. If they have a good argument, you got to listen to them. I'm pretty sure that someone back at MIT is going to criticize me for saying, hey, Max, why are you on talking to people at the Epoch Times? You know, I'm a scientist. I will talk with anybody. I will listen to anybody also. And that's the scientific method, you know. If you go to Verity.news, it's all the different perspectives are in there. And we actually use machine learning to figure out what people from the different sides of a controversy all agree on. We call those the facts. And then we also separate out where they disagree. So people can just go in if they're busy, you know, oh, this seems to have happened because Fox News and CNN agree on it. And here is what these people say, here's what these people say, now I can make my own mind up. That's how I want to have it as scientist too. If someone is arguing about a vaccine or anything controversial, I want to see, okay, these ones say this, these say this. Now I can decide for myself.
And one of the big challenges is that we have something that I call the megaphone, but it's like when you have, you know, an information ecosystem where there's, for some reason, consensus on an issue, no matter how crazy it turns out to be years later, right? And then that kind of it dominates the information ecosystem. Right, so according to your algorithms, you might think because of that, well, that's the truth. Because look, all these different media agree on this point. You know, one example was this idea of Russiagate. There was this false narrative that the president was a Russian agent. Everybody was writing it. You would think you would have believed it almost, right? But except that we were asking the difficult questions that got us in huge trouble. And of course, you know, you're vindicated later, but you suffer along the way. And the question is,
just like Galileo.
Just like Galileo. But is Verity News able to distinguish between that? I'm just fascinated by what you're trying to do here.
Yeah, we actually did an interesting experiment. This was with a student, an MIT student, Samantha Delonzo, where we gave AI 1 million news articles to read and asked it if it could automatically figure out which newspaper wrote the article just by reading the words. And it was remarkably good. And it put all of the newspapers on a two-dimensional plane. The obvious left to right, you know, like if it's an article about abortion, it was pretty easy to tell. The AI discovered that if it talks about fetuses or unborn babies, it could make some guesses as to what views the journalist had about that matter. But there was a whole separate axis also that the AI just found by itself, which is what we call the establishment bias. Are you basically saying the same thing that everybody else is saying, or are you being the Galileo here with saying the unpopular thing? It's often newspapers that are a little bit farther away from power, that don't always echo the big talking points of the corporations and so on. So there is an objective way of ultimately noticing this, and what Verity tries to do is just make sure we sample from all the corners of this for every article. And in particular, whenever there's a topic, you know what the controversy is going to be about it. So you make sure you look at newspapers on both sides of it and see what do they agree on, right?
Yeah.
And so that the viewer can come in very quickly and say, okay, this is what happened, here's what they say, here's what they say, and make their own mind up. It's incredibly important to me that we never tell people what to think, but that we make it easier for them to make up their own mind.
But what you just said is really is super interesting, right? Because what if the AI is injecting inherent bias? I mean, this is what we're this dovetails perfectly,
yeah,
right?
Of course it is, and in two ways. I mean, one is just from its training data and so on, but also if you have a country and all the media is owned by one guy, right? The media will start writing nicer things about that guy. There was a study about what happened to the views of the Washington Post after Jeff Bezos bought it. You will not be so surprised you fall off your chair if I tell you they found that it started criticizing Amazon less, you know. And now we're in a situation where OpenAI, Google, et cetera, these companies are controlling an ever larger fraction of the news that people get through their algorithms, which gives them an outsized power. Is only the beginning of an ever more extreme power concentration that I think we'll see if we keep giving corporate handouts to these AI companies, let them do whatever they want, that they will define the truth, and the truth will always include, oh, and we tech companies are great and should be allowed to do whatever we want.
One of the things that shocks me is that there are actually, in the literature of some of these AI companies, some of them appear to be wanting to create artificial general intelligence. So I'm going to get you to tell me what that is for the benefit of our audience. And also that is astonishing and almost like a kind of, to me, like some sort of odd quasi-religious commitment, right? Which scares the living daylights out of me. So please comment. Yeah.
So first of all, artificial intelligence is just non-biological intelligence. The idea being that anything that has to do with information processing, you don't need to do the information processing in carbon atoms and neurons and brains. We found you can also do it with silicon atoms in computers, right? Intelligence itself in computer science is defined simply as the ability to accomplish goals. It doesn't matter whether the thing has any kind of subjective experience or emotions or anything like that. You just measure it. You know, can it beat you at chess? Can it drive a car better than you? Can it make more money than you at the stock market? That's how we operationally define intelligence. So what's artificial general intelligence then? Well, the AI we have so far is still pretty stupid in many ways. In many cases, it's quite narrow also, that it can do some things and not others. For example, most AI systems today are very passive. What you have there in your iPad is it can answer questions, but it's not out doing anything in the world. It's not making plans for what it's going to do next year, right? Artificial general intelligence is defined simply as AI that can do everything we can do, basically, as well as we can or better. And some of these companies have been put on their website that their goal is therefore to basically automate all economically valuable work. People who say there'll always be jobs that humans can do better than machines are simply predicting that there will never be AGI, artificial general intelligence. They're betting against these companies. And for many years, people thought that AGI was science fiction and it was impossible. You know, we already talked about how people predicted even that ChatGPT was impossible, or at least until 2050. So we should eat humble pie. And I think it's increasingly obvious to people who work in the field that it's absolutely possible. If we get to there, where machines can do all our jobs, that also includes doing the job of making better AI. So very quickly, the R&D timescale for making still better AI will shorten from months to years for human researchers, to maybe weeks or months or days. And machines will keep just improving themselves until they bump up against the next bottleneck, which is the laws of physics. But there is no law of physics saying you can't have something processing information vastly better than us, right? You're a very smart guy, but your brain is limited by the size of your mom's birth canal, right? And moreover, when your brain runs on 20 watts of electricity, like a light bulb, you know, and you can easily put millions of watts into your computer. My laptop runs about 1 billion times faster than my brain also. So once machines start improving themselves, they can get as much smarter than us, I think is obvious, as we are smarter than snails. And if you had the idea that somehow snails were going to control us, or they were going to build us and then control us, you should laugh at this, because it's pretty obviously a tall order. So what I describe now is what's known as superintelligence, which is what probably will come not long after artificial general intelligence. And this is exactly what Alan Turing warned about. He was not worried that your some sort of calculator was going to take over the world. He was worried that we were going to make self-improving machines that would eventually sort of take over. And there's a really interesting historical analogy here, because I know you're quite into history. So Enrico Fermi, the famous physicist, in 1942, he built the first ever nuclear reactor, actually under the football stadium in Chicago. It totally freaked out the world's top physicists when they learned about this. Not because the reactor was dangerous in any way, it wasn't, but because they realized, oh man, this was the last big hurdle to building the nuclear bomb. That was like the Turing test for nuclear bombs. So now they knew maybe it'll take 3 years, 4 years,
but
2 years.
But it's going to happen.
It's going to happen. It's just a matter of engineering now. In fact, it took 3 years there. The Trinity test was in July of 1945, first bomb. It's exactly the same with the Turing test when that was passed now with things like ChatGPT-4, that it became clear that from here on out to building things we could actually lose control over, it's just engineering. There's no fundamental obstacle anymore. And instead, it's all going to come down to political will. What are we going to want to do this or not? Can I inject some optimism in this? Okay. Because just feeling a little gloomy in the direction we're going here. We still have not actually had a nuclear war between the superpowers, because there was a political will not to have one, so we didn't have one, even though there were some close calls. And it's absolutely not a foregone conclusion either that we're just going to hand over the keys to our future to some stupid alien machines, because frankly, almost nobody wants it. There are actually a very small number of tech people who have actually gone on YouTube and places like that and said that they want humanity to be replaced by machines because they're smarter somehow and that's better. I think of that as digital eugenics.
It's deeply nihilistic thought. Like, I can't even imagine what these people are actually thinking. Like, it's insane. Isn't it by definition, maybe? I don't know. Yeah.
I think they're sort of salivating over some sort of digital master race. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not the one who can get into their minds exactly. I believe in free speech. I believe they should have the right to want what they want, but I'm on Team Human. I'm not on their team. I want our children to have the same rights to a long and meaningful life that we have. And frankly, I think you're on my side on this.
I'm deeply on your side, but my concern, I mean, we're talking about this, right, is that I think the people who are actually working on this are above average, more predisposed to the view that you described, and that's the concern, right?
That's why.
And the other part is that with the nuclear bomb, there's this mass physical devastation that happens when you launch one. This is somehow different. This is ethereal, and the mass physical devastation doesn't happen until you've already sort of, ChatGPT doesn't feel like an existential risk the way that a proto-nuclear bomb does.
The biggest difference of all is we have all seen videos of nuclear explosions, and nobody has seen a video or anything about AGI or superintelligence because it's in the future. So the uphill battle you and I have here, if we want to make other people pay attention to this, is imagine we were warning about a nuclear winter in 1942. People be like, what are you even talking about? And if we do get there, there can be plenty of devastation. I mean, the most likely outcome is that it just causes human extinction. And we talked about suppression of and memory holding of inconvenient truths. One of the most memory-hold stories of 2023 was that the CEOs of all of these companies, Sam Altman, Demis Hassabis, Dario Amodei, signed this statement saying, hey, this could cause human extinction. Let's be careful. They said it. It's kind of like if Oppenheimer and Einstein had written a letter warning that nuclear weapons could kill people, and then everybody just sort of forgot about it. So there could be devastation, but it feels so abstract now because it's not today's AI we're afraid of. Yeah, today's AI can, of course, brainwash people, manipulate people, cause power concentration, do censorship. But it's not today's AI that could simply we could lose control over. It's the AI that we'll get in the future if we let it happen. The huge shift that's happened after we passed the Turing test, though, is that this future is no longer decades away, right? Dario Amodei, who leads Anthropic, one of the top American companies, predicts that it'll happen by 2027, 2 years from now, AGI will have what he calls a country of geniuses in a data center, where these geniuses in the data center, these AIs, are better than Nobel laureates in physics and chemistry and math at their various tasks. And so most likely we'll get to the point where this could happen during Trump's presidency. Trump is the AI president. It's going to be what he does during his watch, which determines how this goes. And I promised you some optimism. So here's the optimism. This dystopian future, almost nobody wants it except for some fringe nerds. And that's the main, there have been a lot of polls in the US. The vast majority of Americans absolutely don't want this future. And there's not even any partisan divide on that. Moreover, I think what's beginning to happen is people in the NatSec community are beginning to also realize that this is a national security threat. If you're working in the US NatSec community and your job is to keep tabs on other countries that could pose a NatSec threat, and then you hear some guy talking about a country of geniuses in a data center, you'll think, well, maybe I should put his country on my list to pay attention to also. Do I really want some San Francisco-based nerd who's had too much Red Bull to drink, to make decisions about something that could overthrow the US government? The truth, the painful truth that's really beginning to sink in is that we're much closer to figuring out how to build this stuff than we are to figuring out how to control it. But that's also the good news, because nobody in our NatSec community wants us to build something uncontrollable. Even if you start talking about weapons, you want controllable weapons. We don't want uncontrollable weapons. And it's not, this is the way the NatSec community will think in every country. Take China, for example. I'm pretty sure Xi Jinping would like to not lose his control. So if some Chinese tech company could overthrow him, what do you think he's going to do about that tech company?
One of the things that drives innovation is technological competition. I think that's obvious, right? I think it's a major driver. Like you're trying to kind of get ahead of the other, right? And this is driving, I'm sure, this whole chatbot mass evolution, quick evolution that's happening right now. The difference is that the moment you let the genie out of the bottle, the moment that thing can start building itself, and I don't know at what point. We're rushing right now. We're in an arms race. We have, and you mentioned communist China, Xi Jinping, a completely amoral governing regime. There's no moral boundary to be crossed. You're right. The moral boundary is control. Absolutely, the Chinese Communist Party wants to not relinquish an iota of control. That's true. However, any technology that's outlawed or problematic, CRISPR babies would be a great example. Though technically the guy did go to jail for that, but all that stuff is happening. Okay, why? Because there is no moral boundary, and there's a arms race, technological arms race in all these areas. So we can get ahead. And all these American companies have built AI centers, notably Microsoft and so forth. So that all that information has been siphoned and used, and I'm convinced that the NatSec people or the military people are going to be like, hey, we got to keep pushing the envelope here, because otherwise those other guys are going to be ahead. And then the genie comes out of the bottle, and now it's doing its own thing. How does that not happen? Yeah,
those are really profound questions.
Yeah.
So the key thing is this envelope that you talk about, to think about what is the edge of this envelope actually. it's not so simple that AI is just either you have less of it or you have more of it. Think of there's a space of different kinds of AI systems with different properties. For example, you have a lot of intelligence in your iPad there, but it's narrow intelligence, not very general, and it's, for example, it can't drive, and it doesn't have agency. It doesn't have goals that it's out pursuing with a robotic body in the world.
At least I hope.
Yeah, and the thing that we clearly don't know how to control is actually only when you combine three separate capabilities. When you have not just very strong domain intelligence at what you're good at, like AlphaFold for curing cancer or whatever, and very strong generality, so it knows how to manipulate people and produce new pandemics or whatever, and also agency, autonomy. So it's only when you put those three together that we don't know how to control it. It's also only when you put those three all together that it can do all the human jobs and cause a lot of negative upheavals in maybe in our society. But if you have only one or two of those traits, it's perfectly possible to both control it and also make sure that it just complements people rather than replaces them. You know, you have autonomy and generality in your intelligence, etc. So you're not going to be replaced by something which lacks one of those. So if you think of the Venn diagram, I'm being a nerd now, you know, there's like a donut shape where you just pick one or two of those traits, but not all three. That lets you kind of have the cake and eat it. And I think that's where we're going to end up in the donut, so to speak, because if you want to make a lot of money on AI, you know, suppose you want to build the world's best self-driving car that can drive better than any human driver. We don't have it now. What do you need from this? Yes, of course, you need autonomy, and you need a domain intelligence. It's better be really good at driving. But do you really need it to know how to make bioweapons? Do you need to have so much generality in it that your car can persuade you to vote for your least favorite politician? You probably wouldn't even want that. You just, hey, car, can you just stick to driving, please? You know, and similarly, if you want to cure cancer, you know, there's no reason to teach a cancer-curing AI how to manipulate people or how to drive cars. So I think what we're going to, this is my optimism, where the race is going to shift is towards these kinds of, towards tool AI, the kind of AI here in the donut where we know how to control it. To me, a tool is what I can control. I like to drive a powerful car, not an uncontrollable car, right? Similarly, what military commander in any country is going to want an uncontrollable drone swarm? I think they would prefer the controllable kind, right?
Yes.
So they're not going to put all this extra AGI stuff in it so it can persuade the commander of something else. And we will see a competition of who can build the best tools between companies, between countries. But there will be at some point a hard line drawn by the NetSec community saying no one can make stuff that we don't know how to control. And you're right that people in different companies, different countries have very different views of things. But the Soviet Union US dynamic shows that you don't need to necessarily agree on everything to agree not to have a nuclear winter. You know, it's not like there was any great trust between Ronald Reagan and Brezhnev, right? But they still never nuked each other because they both realized that this was just suicide. And they never even signed a treaty to that effect. There was no treaty where Reagan hugged Brezhnev on a stage and said, I promise not to nuke you. Because the US knew that the Russians viewed it as suicide, trying to nuke the US. And the Russians knew that the converse was also true. And so you had the red line that nobody crossed. And I think building uncontrollable, smarter than human machines is exactly the same kind of red line. Once it becomes clear to everybody that that's just suicide and no one is going to do it, instead, what people will do is race with tools, and then they'll come up with some basic safety standards just to protect their own people. Like, do you know that AI is currently the only industry in the US that makes powerful stuff that has less regulation than sandwiches? Like if someone has a sandwich shop in San Francisco, right, before they can sell their first sandwich, some
There's
health
a lot
inspector
of,
checks out the kitchen. Right?
and a great many other things. Yes, correct.
Yeah, if someone in OpenAI has this crazy, uncontrollable superintelligence and wants to release it tomorrow, they can legally do so. It used to be that way also for example, for medicines. Have you heard of thalidomide?
Yes.
Yeah, so, caused babies to be born without arms or legs, right? If there were no FDA, I'm sure there would be all sorts of new thalidomide equivalents released on a monthly basis in the US, and people wouldn't trust medicines as much, and there would be a horrible situation. But because we've now just put some basic safety standards in place saying, hey, if you want to sell a new drug in the US, first show me your clinical trial results. And it can't just say in the application, I feel good about this. It has to be quantitative and nerdy. This many percent of the people actually get the benefit. This many people actually get this side effect, that side effect. The companies now have an incentive to innovate and race to the top. And within a couple of miles of my office, we have one of the biggest biotech concentrations in the US. Those companies spend so much money innovating on safety, figuring out how to make their drugs safe. They take it very seriously because that's the way you get to market first, right? If you just had even the most basic safety standards for AI, the same would happen with the AI industry. They would shift from spending 1% of their money on safety stuff to spending a lot more, so that they could be the first to go to market with their things, and we would have vastly better products. And I'm not talking about some sort of horrible innovation stifling red tape, of which there has been much, of course. I'm talking about very basic stuff. I think it would even benefit the AI industry itself. The worst thing that could happen to our American competitiveness in AI is that some dudes with hubris just ruin it for everyone else and cause a huge backlash.
Right. Well, so unfortunately, for regular viewers of the show will understand, that we've often kind of, criticized the regulatory systems for let's say, development of medicines and so on and so forth. Not as bullish, although I do believe that there's an attempt at the FDA right now and other health agencies to create the scenario that you exactly described more so, created more so. So.
I just want to be clear here. I'm not some sort of starry-eyed person who thinks that the regulation necessarily is all great. There's horrible examples of regulatory capture, massive overreach.
100%.
But there's also examples like thalidomide, where I don't know anyone of any political persuasion who thinks it's good that people were allowed to sell the thalidomide. So somewhere in the middle is the optimum amount of safety standards. And
I was only saying this for the benefit of the people who are skeptical of our regulatory system that watch. But
I'm
there's
just saying
plenty.
that having less regulations on kind of new species AI that we have no idea how to control than on sandwiches doesn't feel like we've gotten it quite right.
Yes. Okay. I think we can absolutely agree on that. Okay. So your approach is kind of build AIs as tools.
Yeah.
Not aspire to sort of sentience and the three circles kind of coalescing around to not too much generality in particular, I think is the
we
issue,
should not
right?
just try to build replacements for ourselves, try to aspire to just build replacement humans. We should build tools that make our lives better. And we talked about safety standards. Safety standard on sandwich might be like, should not give you salmonella. Safety standard for AI the one thing I would insist goes on that list is it's a tool. Before you release it, your job is to persuade the FDA for AI or whatever it's called that this is a tool that can be controlled. And actually, it's even better. Of course, if you have if the thing has no agency, if it's just a chatbot answering questions or telling you how to cure cancer, it's very easy to see how you can control it and have it be a tool. But you can even have agency. I don't lose any sleep over future self-driving cars taking over the world. They have agency, autonomy. They really want to go from A to B safely and et cetera, et cetera. But they lack the generality to pose a real threat. as long as we don't teach them again how to manipulate people and make bioweapons and all sorts of other stuff that they really don't need to know. And there's a lot of cool science happening, actually. This is what we work on in my MIT research group, actually. How can you take an AI that knows too much, stuff that's not necessary for the product, and distill out of that an AI that just knows what it needs to know to really do the job?
That is really the question, because how do you know that you didn't inject that code that is, that it's sort of quietly outside of your purview, developing its sentience, or something like this, right?
I can tell you, actually.
Yeah.
It's the way you do it is, let me make an analogy. Suppose you figure out on your own a new algorithm for navigating a rocket to the International Space Station. How do I know for sure that you're not secretly going to instead crash it into the White House or something? Well, I have no reason to doubt your motives, but the safer way to do it is say, instead of having you sit there and steer the rocket, I'll just ask you, okay, can you take your new algorithm and just code it up, write a computer program in some Python or some programming language that steers a rocket, and give it to me. And then I can look at that, and other people can look at it to make sure that all it does is steer the rocket to the space station and not into the White House. Mm-hmm. I don't have to trust you anymore to trust the tool you built me. And the amazing thing is AIs now are getting very capable at writing code. So what we work on in my group is, if you have an AI that's figured out how to do your tool, you tell it to write some computer program that is the tool, and also write a proof that it's going to actually do exactly what you want. Now you have a guarantee, actually, that you can run an automatic proof checker and be fully assured that this thing actually is only going to do what you want, even if you don't trust the maker of it. It's a little bit like if you talk to someone who's a mathematician, and you ask, why do you trust this theorem from Irene when you don't, like, what if, or from this other mathematician who seems very untrustworthy? You'll answer, well, because I checked the proof. I don't have to trust the one who wrote it. So because AIs are getting so good at doing programming now and even proving things, we are opening this new chapter where we actually we'll have the ability to make tools that we know are always going to remain tools. So many people tell me, I'm not worried about the future of AI because AI will always be a tool based on hope. Mm-hmm. I say instead, let's not worry about AI because we will just insist that AI be a tool. Mm. Companies will then innovate to always guarantee that, and then we actually create the tool AI future where we can all prosper. Basically everything we want. When I talk to people from industry, from work in hospitals, really anyone, what people we want are tools to figure out how to cure cancer, to figure out how to avoid the stupid traffic accidents, to make ourselves more strong and prosperous and so on. That's what we really want, not build some sort of crazy digital master race that's going to replace us.
I am absolutely convinced that this needs to be regulated. I'm not a fan of overregulation by any means, but obviously there has to be rules here. So there's, it's actually kind of interesting. There's a legislation that's being put into, the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, mm-hmm. right? That actually would prevent states from regulating AI, right? And that's odd. Given, I'm kind of, it's something I've been thinking about, given our conversation here. And I'm not even convinced the regulation is going to work, but I still think it obviously is needed, right? In order to at least try to keep them tools and not this other thing that you described.
Yeah, this so-called preemption legislation where they basically bans this, usurp state rights, and say for the next 10 years Texas isn't allowed to do anything at all, even if they want to protect Texans against non-consensual sexual defects. It's clearly just the corporate boondoggle by the same. We talked about power concentration before and how these companies are often trying to shape public opinion in their favor. So it's not surprising that they're also trying to just make sure that they can keep their monopolies and and be allowed to continue doing, whatever they want with no oversight. It's not surprising that they're pushing it. The idea of just taking away constitutional rights from states for 10 years on an important issue, I think would make some of our founding fathers just turn it over in their grave. And second, it's just so transparent that this is a corporate handout. It's corporate welfare boondoggle that they're asking for. Next thing, if you pass something like this, next thing they're going to ask for is that AI companies should pay negative income tax, or it's.
But steel manning it. What is the argument?
It's the same argument that the car companies made against seatbelts, and that the thalidomide maker of thalidomide made against why there should be any clinical trials. You're going to destroy the innovation, destroy the industry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I see.
And then, of course, the argument that works best in Washington also to get rid of any regulation is to say, but China. But as
this is the arms race. This is and in some situations that it's compelling because you're thinking to yourself, look, we definitely don't want them to be imposing anything here. That it would be a terrible world.
Right.
But communist China I'm talking about. Yeah.
But the key point is first of all that if Sam Altman wants to release the digital master race, and the state of Texas says no, you can't do that, saying that he has to release the digital master race so that Americans get destroyed by the American digital master race AI rather than the Chinese, is a pretty lame argument. We don't want anyone to do this, including our own companies. There are, of course, very serious geopolitical issues. Of course there are. But that does not mean that lobbyists aren't going to be crafty and try to twist them into arguments that are very self-serving for them. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. I mean, that's kind of what lobbyists do, right?
Yes.
So I want to talk about something that you seem to be quite interested in, and it's this idea of the Compton constant.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that again, I guess we're going pessimistic again here. This is like a measure of how likely that we're going to get wiped out by AI, if I'm not mistaken, right? So, I mean, it's this obviously has utility, right? But having been a modeler myself at one point, I know that a model can only be as good as the information you put in. How could we possibly know the variables to fit into something like this? And does it even have any real utility, right? From that, because of that, like, I can't understand the dimensions that would fit into it, but perhaps you can. Please tell me.
So here's how I think about this. The way to get a good future with AI is just to treat the AI industry like every other industry with some sort of with some quantitative safety standards, right? So if some company says we're going to release thalidomide, and the FDA says, does it have any risks? Does it cause birth defects? And the company says, we think the risks are small. The FDA is going to come back and say, how small exactly? What's the percentage? Show us your clinical trial. This is how we do it with airplanes also, with nuclear reactors. To open a nuclear reactor here in DC, you have to actually show a calculation that shows that the risk is less than 1 in 10,000 of meltdown per year, stuff like this. So we would like to do the same thing for future very powerful AI systems. What's the probability that they're going to escape control? And the reason we call this the Compton constant in this very nerdy paper my MIT group released is in honor of the physicist Compton, who estimated before the first nuclear bomb test, the Trinity test, that the probability of that igniting the atmosphere and killing everyone on Earth was less than 1 in 30,000. And this was a very influential calculation he made, because
clearly
it was because that number was estimated to be so small that the U.S. military decided to go ahead and do the Trinity tests in July of 2045. I'm pretty sure that if you had calculated that it's 98% chance that it's going to ignite the atmosphere, they would have postponed the test and commissioned a much more careful calculation, right? So our very modest proposal is that you should similarly require the AI companies to actually make a calculation. Yeah, they say the risk is small, that they're going to lose control, but how small? And we actually did this analysis. We took one of the most popular approaches pushed by the companies for how they're going to control something smarter than them, which is that you have a very smart AI controlled by a slightly dumber AI, controlled by a slightly dumber AI, etc., kind of like Russian dolls stacked inside of each other. We found that the Compton constant was higher than 90% chance that you just lose control over this thing. Maybe there are better methods they can come up with in the future, but right now I think it's fair to say that we really have no clue how to control vastly smarter than human machines, and we should be honest about it, and we should insist that if someone wants to release them into the United States, they should first actually calculate the Compton constant, quantify it, just like the pharma industry and the aircraft industry and everybody else has to do for their products.
I find it really interesting, your portrayal of this AI, which we're trying to not create in a way, right? You know, aliens are very common topic for humanity for, you know, quite some time now. But you're saying, no, we're actually making that. We're actually creating these things. And the way they think could become very quickly extremely unimaginable to us. How they exist, they make decisions. Even the sort of the more moral dimensions, is there even anything like that, right?
It's a very, very deep question. And I'm going to be humble here and say that this is not something I can give a glib answer to. And I think if someone else does give a glib answer, I can explain why they're overconfident. What we do know for sure, the space of systems one could build that process information in some way is vastly, vastly broader than the kind of information processing systems that exist in brains. We humans have so much in common with each other. Even fierce political opponents, you know, still love their children, still have so many other very basic things in common that they would by default not have in common with machines at all. You could imagine very alien minds that just don't give a damn about children and think of children just the way they would think of another obstacle, a stone or something in the way, and just completely, maybe they don't have anything like human emotions and really just couldn't care one way or the other if all humans go extinct or not. We have a very common heritage, all humans on this earth, right? That gives us this bond. We're opening up a Pandora's box here of other kind of minds where it would be a huge mistake to think that they're going to be anything like us by default, you know. And what we see now, there's a sadly large number of people who already have AI girlfriends, for example, which are entirely fake. They have big googly eyes and say sexy things, but there's absolutely no evidence that there's anyone home or that this is anything other than just a total deception. Let's not fall for that, you know. The fact that there is such a vast space of possible AIs we can make can also be used very much to our advantage. We can actually let's figure out instead how to make AI tools that will be loyal servants to us and help us cure cancer and help us with all sorts of other things. This is not like talking about nuclear war where either something bad happens or nothing happens. If we get this right, it will be the most amazing positive development in the history of humanity. We spent most of our time on Earth here with a life expectancy of 29 years and died of famine and all sorts of curable diseases. You know, even my grandfather died of a kidney infection that you could just cure with antibiotics, you know. So technology is empowering us to make life so much more wonderful and inspiring for us, for future generations and so on. And if we can successfully amplify our technology with tools, you know, that help us solve all the problems that our ancestors have been stumped by, we can create a future that's even more inspiring, I would say, than anything science fiction writers really dreamt of. Let's do that. You know, in the story of Icarus, you know, he gets these wings with which he could have done awesome stuff, but instead he just kept obsessing about flying to the sun. and
Precisely.
ended badly. Artificial intelligence is giving us humans these incredible intellectual wings with which to solve all these problems, if we just stop obsessing about trying to build AGI.
Well, so, of course, you have the Future of Life Institute, and you actually you have a whole kind of series of, I guess you could say proposals or approaches, and you have an action plan for AI. Give me some more concrete thoughts about what you think should happen to keep the genie in the bottle, so to speak.
Our government is developing a new action plan for what to do about this, which is really great. They're putting a lot of thought into it. Some very easy wins for starters would be to make sure that they get input not just from a bunch of tech bros in San Francisco, but also from, for example, the faith community, because I strongly believe we need a moral compass to guide us here. And that has to be something more than the profit of some San Francisco company. There has to be people in the room who are driven by their own inner North Star. The conversation has to be not just about what we can do, but what we ought to do. And for that reason, I'm actually very excited that a group of evangelical leaders has come. I was doing this letter to the president saying that we need moral leadership here. We need to focus on what's actually good for Americans, not just for some tech CEO in San Francisco. We need to build these tools that make America strong and powerful and prosperous, not some sort of dystopian replacement species. So that's one thing. A second thing, I think, very concrete thing is let Texas and other states do what they want. Don't try to usurp their power and let some lobbyists here in DC decide everything. I think is just start treating the AI industry like all the other industries again, by having just some basic safety standards. They can start extremely basic, like before you release something that you might be able to lose control over, show us a calculation. What's the chance that you're going to lose control over it, and then let the government decide whether it gets released or not. And ultimately, I think it shouldn't be scientists like me who decide exactly what the safety standard should be. This should be decided by democratic means. But just it takes a while to build up any kind of institutions for safety standards, so that we can start with that right now.
In other words, more regulation, or
I prefer saying safety standards, because that's really what it is.
Right.
You set a bar. Industry hates uncertainty and vague things, but if you say this is the bar, you have to. If you're going to sell a new cancer drug, you better make sure it saves more lives than it takes.
Right.
If you're going to release a new AI that's super powerful, you better show that you can control it. The benefits outweigh the harms. It's basic standards, and then how they get enforced exactly can leave to the experts.
This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I greatly enjoyed it. Any final thought as we finish?
Just to end on a positive note again, ultimately, technology is not evil. It's also not morally good. I want it to be a tool. I want us to put a lot of thought into how we make sure we use this tool for good things, not for bad things. We have solved that problem successfully with tools like fire. You can use it for very good barbecues or for arson, and we put some regulations in place and so on, so that the use of fire generally is very positive in America, and same for knives, and same for so much else. And we can totally do the same thing with AI. And if we do that, we will actually building the most inspiring future you can imagine, where seemingly incurable diseases get cured, where we can have a future where people are healthy and wealthy and prosperous and live incredibly inspiring lives. It's this hope, not the fear, which is really driving me.
Well, Max Tegmark, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you all for joining Max Tegmark and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.